Good evening and welcome. Why do philosophical friendships so often break up or blow up? It's a tough question, but today I'm gonna tackle it a little bit. At least I'm gonna look at one factor that I think may be quite important in this regard. And I'm gonna try to keep this video pretty short because people have lives and it seems like they don't have time to watch anything that's over 15 minutes, so I'm gonna try to keep it under that. And to begin with, I'd like to define what do I mean by a philosophical friendship, or at least what type of philosophical friendship I'm gonna talk about here. The type of friendship that we're going to be looking at is one that's based on kind of mutual openness and mutual curiosity. Stefan Molyneux at Free Domain Radio has termed this approach RTR, real-time relationships, which is basically where you strive to let the other person know what you feel, think, and kind of sense in the moment, so that both of you are kind of saturated with what's going on right now, as opposed to you kind of passing judgments on the other person's behavior or your behavior. You kind of report what's going on for you, and then you can kind of talk about it. So I've observed, and unfortunately experienced in my life as well, that often when people with seemingly very similar values, values, let's say, of rationality and non-violence, non-aggression, self-knowledge, when such people come together and then try to apply this approach to friendship, often what results after a period, it depends on the relationship, but after some period, what often results is some sort of resentment, some sort of falling out, and that type of thing. And I'm gonna present two perspectives. One from the standpoint of attachment theory, and the other from the standpoint of internal family systems psychotherapy. And they kind of say the same thing, though, from kind of two angles. So we'll start with the attachment perspective. First, what is attachment? Attachment is basically inborn propensity to secure a bond, the infant's propensity to secure a bond with the caregiver or caregivers. Usually it's one or two people, usually the parents, and it's based in pure survival, because the infant is so helpless to take care of any of his or her needs. They need somebody who knows what's going on, who can bring food and shelter, and who can interact with the infant and change its diapers and all of that. And depending on how the caregivers interact with the infant will develop a certain attachment style. So if the caregiver is empathetic to the infant and caters to its needs, and is smiling at it and is playing with it, the infant will get a message from it that the infant, I am good, I'm worthwhile, I am lovable, and that type of thing. And this is called secure attachment. The infant then, as the child grows, can then use the parent as a secure base to come back to from different explorations, which may be dangerous and interesting and exciting. They can run back to mom or dad and for reassurance and for security, for safety. Then there are different types of insecure attachment. There can be avoidant, which is where infant avoids their caregiver. They can be clinging, where infant is so fearful that they can't let go of their caregiver, and they become extremely distressed when the caregiver goes away. There can be disorganized attachment, where these patterns of clinginess and avoidance may be intermixed, and even certain things like the infant or the child may play the parent role emotionally, to the parent, so kind of reversal of roles in that regard. There are other types of disorganized attachment, and perhaps the most disturbing would be something that's called infanticidal attachment. This is where the parent either explicitly acts out death wish towards the infant by choking or trying to kill the infant, basically, or they symbolically act it out, either through just glaring or certain interactions, or by, let's say, ripping open a teddy bear with a knife, just crazy stuff like that, which unfortunately happens all too often. Obviously, in such situations, the attachment situation for the infant is just saturated with extreme terror and usually shame and perhaps guilt. I think it's hard for us as adults even empathize with what it's like for an infant, and when I think about it, the closer I come is probably some sort of situation of complete chaotic mayhem, like perhaps the front lines of a war, or being bombed, or something like that, where it's basically hell on earth. But this is what it's like for an infant to be in the care of a caregiver who is sadistic or perhaps even extremely manipulative. So this is the attachment part. From the attachment perspective, what I think may be happening in these types of philosophical friendships, where people strive to be vulnerable with the other person and open, and to always talk about their feelings in the moment, is, I think, not very often, I think it's kind of inevitable that in these situations, people's attachment styles will be reawakened. Okay? And the idea with real-time relationships, or this type of friendship that I'm talking about, is even if it's difficult to kind of be real with people and express their feelings to them in a vulnerable way, you should kind of still do it. And then it'll get easier, and your relationship will get stronger. And you perhaps will be working with a therapist on the side, and it will be a healing and a growth-inducing relationship. And I think absolutely, it's very often it's that way. But I think what often happens, if the people who are striving for this type of relationship come from extremely disturbed attachment patterns, then just by virtue of you interacting with the other person in such a vulnerable way, it's very, very reminiscent of those early attachment situations. And all of that shame, all of that pain, things that frankly are often just unnameable because they took place at the preverbal stage of development. I'll do a little caveat here and mention that according to my book of human development, which is a very recent textbook, the biggest spur of brain development and brain growth happens right before birth and in the first 6 months after birth. So, and of course, this is a preverbal stage for an infant. So a lot of these feelings and frankly just body sensations and tensions in your muscles, in your brain, everywhere, hormones, just this really raw experience may come up for people. And it's very hard to make sense of it in the moment. Well, very hard to say the very least. But I think what may happen for people is, let's say they, meet a person who has this similar value of being open with the other person and building this type of friendship, is people will kind of like feel these old attachment experiences or something overwhelming come up for them, but they'll kind of like push through it. Okay, in the hopes that it'll get easier and it'll get better. And again, of course not always, and perhaps in the minority of situations, I don't know, but often what happens is these attachment patterns just kind of catch up with people, because you can't just will through them, at least not always. And these attachment patterns, again, they're not verbal, and people, I think, often don't understand what's happening. And these attachment patterns, can take years and years of slowly working on in therapy, and perhaps they never resolve themselves for some people. And I think what happens if people kind of like just push through these attachment patterns, just will through them, is all of those experiences kind of come back with a vengeance and then overwhelm the person, and the person may start to see basically the other party, the other friend or the other friends, as their parents or caregivers, people who hurt them in terrible ways when they were kids or perhaps infants, and then the friendship blows up. So this is the attachment perspective. How am I on time? All right, well, the internal family systems therapy perspective that I see is this. Quickly, internal family systems therapy is a method of therapy which assumes that we are composed of sub-personalities psychically, or parts. And there are two basic types of parts. One type of part is called exiles, which is parts of us which are stuck in traumatic experiences and which still hold on to the shame, fear, guilt, etc. All the overwhelming feelings, thoughts, and emotions from the traumatic experiences in our lives. So these are exiles. And then there are protectors. I don't know why I kind of sang out that word, but protectors. These are parts of us whose goal, whose job is to protect those exiled parts. And these protectors can come in any number of ways. For example, if you were abandoned as a child, as an adult, you may have a part of you that thinks, oh, I'm this very self-sufficient person. I don't need relationships. Relationships are trouble. And it kind of keeps you in this safe zone where you don't have to risk, vulnerability to be in a relationship or to try to build a relationship with somebody. Or another type of protector can be, let's say, if you get overwhelmed with feelings of shame or fear for whatever reason, then you may go and eat a whole cheesecake to kind of soothe those feelings away. So these are two examples of protectors. Now, to look at this situation of a philosophical friendship blowing up from the IFS, internal family systems perspective, then, if people, get together and again they strive to be vulnerable and be quite open in the moment with the other person regarding their internal experiences, these protectors pretty much inadvertently will come up and basically say, hey, don't go there. What you're doing is whatever, bad, dangerous, shameful, anything. But people will be like, kind of try to take a step back and be like, okay, these are just my protectors, I'm still doing the right thing, right? And they'll again kind of will through these protectors, kind of like brushing them aside to a certain degree. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. And I think depending, if your trauma is not very deep, that can work very well. I think especially if you're that critical 6 months at the beginning of your life, or perhaps the first year, when you were parented in a very nurturing and empathetic way, and then after that, you had like public school, or you had some bullies, or some people who hurt you, but you have that very deep base of secure attachment. I think kind of willing through these things can often work, and these protectors will kind of relax because just because you're not traumatized too much in this respect, I guess we can put it that way. But what can often happen too is that these protectors may kind of shut up or quiet down for a while, but then again they come back with a vengeance, and then and they'll overwhelm the person with criticism, with extreme feelings of shame and guilt, with extreme body tensions, and the person with kind of may lose perspective kind of on the situation, and understandably so, completely understandably. And the person may start acting out these protectors, let's say by blaming other people or by shaming other people, or they may start acting out those protectors against themselves by criticizing themselves and shaming themselves, and perhaps engaging in some sort of addiction. And as a result, again, what we get is the friendship blowing up. In conclusion, none of what I said, is to say that striving to be open and honest with other people is a bad thing. I think it's a great thing. It's the best thing, rationally. Now, psychologically, if you were deeply traumatized, if you perhaps have some early trauma that's pre-verbal, that's unconscious, that you don't have even much access to, so to speak, then have some empathy for yourself. And again, everybody will of course make their own decision as to when to take time off and when to say, hey, I just need to spend some time by myself, or I don't know, we can perhaps talk about the different strategies one can take at another time. But I guess the purpose of this video is just to, if anything like that ever happened to you, or if you have had a philosophical friendship break up, then perhaps these considerations will give you some more empathy for yourself. And for people who are maybe about to start friendships that are based on mutual honesty and mutual openness, this can give them some heads up, because often, kind of knowing about what can potentially happen can make you feel quite empowered and get you through the storm much more smoothly, so to speak. Well, that's about it, and I appreciate your time. Thanks for watching.